Good afternoon and welcome to Teaching and Learning TV. Teaching and Learning TV is an initiative of the University of KwaZulu-Natal Teaching and Learning Annual Conference. It's in its 10th year of running this year, and we are filming outside of Durban, well, not outside of Durban, inside Durban. Beautiful ocean behind us, and I'm very pleased this afternoon to be speaking to our guests, distinguished guests, all experts in the area of the intellectualization of indigenous languages in higher education. And so I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panel. First up, we have Professor Bamgbose, who is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the University of Ibadan. Professor Bamgbose, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yes. And would you like to say something about what your current interest is in this topic? We'll pick up on the discussion a little bit later.
Well, my interest in the area of language in relation to this particular conference is how to move from lower levels of education up to the point that we can begin to address issues in indigenous languages. Over the years, we've had problems with our children being taught in a language that is not native to them. And in many cases, they are made to carry out activities which they are not ready for in the imported language in which they are being taught. And this has affected progress to other levels, like secondary school, up to the point that today, although we have students who take degrees in African languages, we have not been able to move up to the point of using African languages to teach non-language subjects like physics or chemistry. And my interest in this conference to see why we have problems moving to this level and what we can do. Thank you.
So you're interested in not just the content of African languages being taught, but the medium of instruction.
Yes,
and
that's
so
right. Yes.
How do we begin to develop that in
Yes,
Africa?
that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Langa Khumalo, Director of Language Planning and Development at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Always a pleasure to have you in studio. Welcome.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure also, Professor Netta, to be on studio to talk about language and the intellectualization of African languages, because that's something that sits very deep in my heart, to see the cultivation of African languages so that they can do what English and other well-developed languages like French can do in the knowledge economy. So UKZN has initiated a language program that seeks to intellectualize isiZulu so that it becomes a language of the academy, a language of teaching and learning, research, innovation, and science. So that's our remit in the Language Planning and Development Office.
Great. And I'll be looking forward to hearing about that development and where you would see how far we have come and how much more we have to go. So thanks, Dr. Khumalo. And then we have Professor Sam Mchombo, who's Associate Professor of African Languages and Linguistics at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Professor Mchombo. I almost said Chibambo because I know someone who's Chibambo also that hails from Malawi, but you're very welcome. Perhaps you want to share with us what you are interested in.
Thank you. And in many respects, like my colleagues here, I come from a background of having been involved, in not just African linguistics, but theoretical linguistics as well. So in a sense, you look at the intricacies of African linguistic structure and how that has informed progress in linguistic theory, and you come to realize that, yes, certainly our languages have had quite a lot to offer to scholarship in general. But in more recent times, I've been focusing more on the issue of the content of the education we have in Africa and the medium of instructions, the languages that are used, especially in the lower levels, because the higher education has to, get people from the lower levels. And the question is, how do you prepare, the children at, that stage? And as Professor Bamgbose has pointed out, we happen to have children who get exposed to education where the tradition has been that the content of what they learn is foreign, and the language in which it is delivered to them is equally foreign. And part of it, I think there's been a general impression that, the foreign languages, are to be used. A recurrent argument has been that because they are also more suited to, science education. And so part of my current work has been looking at, the content of, let's say, math and science, and to demystify the myth, to eliminate that, our languages are linguistically, as it were, inadequate to deal with, scientific concepts or science education, in general. So that's sort of been my current, interest, and looking at what, how do we decolonize, as it were, the curriculum, the content, and how do we begin to change attitudes towards the use of, local languages as languages of instruction, especially in the beginning stages.
Yes, certainly.
Right, yes.
Certainly. So I'm hearing, this particular discussion takes on, I think, an even a greater significance, at least in our own higher education context currently, as we speak, in fact, with the calls for a decolonized university, a decolonized curriculum. And so, and the various levels I'm hearing us talk about here is that it's not just what happens at higher education, but how is this developed from, from the time children are at school, but more so how moving beyond just a medium of instruction to an intellectual language, this so-called linguistic deficiency that you're referring to, right? What needs to be done? Is there really a linguistic deficiency? And if there is, what needs to be done? And so perhaps I'm going to open that up to begin with as for our discussion, and let's see where we go from there. Maybe let's address this notion of linguistic deficiency.
I don't agree that there is linguistic deficiency. What people refer to as linguistic deficiency is simply the inability of African languages to be used to express certain concepts.
Okay.
And it's a trite saying in linguistics that there is no concept that cannot be expressed in any language, provided the need to do so arises. So the question is not whether a language is deficient. The question is whether language development activities have taken place to enable that language to express the concepts that are available to be expressed. For example, all the things that happen in the sciences, you would say an African language cannot be used to express oxygen or poison or whatever. But if you look at indigenous ways of expressing these concepts, there are already some terms available, which we ignore when we talk about these things.
Is that a problem of doing more technical, people were looking at technical, so trying to find a technical equivalent in another language rather than looking conceptually? Because from what I hear you saying,
right,
there
right.
are
Yes,
conceptions,
there are a number of
right?
ways of handling this. In fact, the last resort, really, is when you cannot find anything and you borrow a term from another language. But borrowing is not the important thing. You borrow and then make it express that concept. The important thing is the concept. It's not the term itself.
That's right.
But we start by looking at our languages what concepts are there already that are already expressed that people do not know.
Right.
I'll give you a practical example. When we were trying to formulate meta-language, a language for teaching languages, we were looking for a term that can express the glottis in articulatory phonetics. And we looked for translation from English until one of us, who happened to have been the son of a butcher, came up with the part of the cow, which is the glottis. And we adopted that term.
Right.
We, so-called eggheads, did not know about it before,
Right.
until he came up with this term. And there are many terms like that that are available in our languages that people are not aware of.
Right.
And when we have done that, we can then move on also to expand the meanings of existing words. For example, we were trying to find a term for a chart, a linguistic chart. And instead of borrowing and saying charty or something like that, we simply said, let's expand the meaning of an existing item. What do our women do when they display tomato, pepper for sale? There's a tray that they use. This tray has a term. So let's extend that term for that tray to take the place of chart. So semantic expansion, extension, this is also a way of handling this.
And so this is part of the move towards also recognizing that language, like culture, and like other variables, are never fixed.
Oh, yes,
right?
yes,
That they're
yes.
always evolving,
Oh, yes.
and so to set something in stone almost implies that there might be other agendas going on when people
Yeah.
want to do that,
Yeah.
right? We know
Yeah.
this. So when people, for example, I always use this example about patriarchy, right? So people say, this is how it's done in our culture. It's as if you've never moved in your culture on any other issue except this one issue, then we must remain, right? But this idea of developing the languages and finding the conceptual, I don't know if it's conceptual equivalence, or it also goes beyond just finding conceptual equivalence, isn't it? It's not just about, but there's a deeper, and I think I want to talk about that particularly in our current higher education context, is the political significance of doing that. What does it mean politically to do that? Perhaps.
Especially in our higher education context, where we have had this hashtag fees must fall movement,
yes.
right? At the center of that movement is also the call for a shift in our education system to affirm African languages in the curriculum, and also to decolonize the curriculum in ways that begin to look at epistemes more from our context rather than from the imposed European context. So the whole process of developing African languages so that they become the vehicle through which we express our knowledge systems and contribute meaningfully to the larger discourses, to the knowledge economy, so that we could begin to participate actively in the knowledge production and knowledge dissemination processes. It's vitally important, and our students are beginning to see that. And that's the danger when our development as a people are fueled by our youngsters. They have a lot of energy, and lots of things in their way will break.
Yes.
Because they have a lot of oomph with it. Instead of planning and effectively dealing with these kind of unfortunate incidences. So the lack, the significance of this conference and the program that we have at UKZN is that when you look at our students, when they begin to talk about language issues and language development issues, they see that the university has a comprehensive plan. Because not only do we have a policy on language, we have an implementation plan on how to roll out this language development thing at UKZN. And we have used a lot of the strategies that Prof. Bamgbose has mentioned when you're developing terminology, because again, one of the things that are often cited when you're talking about introducing an African language to the curriculum, they will tell you, but there is paucity of terminology. How are you going to teach physics? Because the language can't handle physics concepts. We have actually moved on to say we are going to initiate processes to develop terminology in these multiplicity of disciplines. And in doing that, there is a theory, there is a framework
for how
to develop terminology. And these strategies are the strategies that we have in our panel discussions. That, okay, do we have to go out there and get an English term, a Latin term, all other terms before we look into the language and see whether the language has the capacity to express these things? And they are actually odious processes, very, very strenuous processes, very argumentative processes, and a lot of resource-intensive processes. But UKZN, through its executive, have committed resources to the development of terminology, which is very unique. I think when we talk about our UKZN language program, we are always met with this that, wow, your executive allows in money to develop terminology. And right now we have developed 11 disciplines, different disciplines, from anatomy, architecture to physics.
Yes.
You know, all these disciplines now have terminology. And now we're looking at strategies to avail this terminology so that it becomes part of discourse in the disciplines in which they are produced. So we are actively implementing this program, and again, it's thanks to the foresight of the institution to have a policy and couple that policy with an implementation
plan. But surely this is happening alongside other imperatives. So you have this imperative to indigenize knowledge, to and in that process politicize knowledge production, right? But that has to happen alongside the imperatives of higher education, which push us to internationalization and globalization. And I'm sure you've heard these arguments over and over. And Professor Mchombo, maybe you would want to say more about what does that mean for internationalization? What does it mean for globalization when this very needed process, right? It's an important one, particularly in our current moment, in this decolonial moment. It has to happen. What does that mean?
Well, in some regards, the idea of globalization, internationalization, etc., is sometimes used as a subterfuge for not pushing the political, importance of the revisions to the content of education, as well as promotion of the the local languages. We realize that what is meant by globalization is the fact that we have to interact with other countries, markets, open up, etc. And that languages like English tend to be used for that. And one doesn't take away from the sort of the international status that English has acquired. But that does not necessarily translate into saying that learning is always geared to those ends. Knowledge, I have cited a philosopher who used to be at Berkeley, Paul Fairbairn, who pointed out that most of knowledge is local, and that when what you engage in has to do with understanding your world, and clearly, of course, interacting with others does expand your knowledge, but does not take away from what you should be contributing, and that much as, let's say, the children in my village may have to deal with a globalized world, getting them to understand basic concepts really has to do with how do they deal with the environment, and you start from the knowns to the unknowns, and the the globalization, they are not, it's kind of an interesting, thing, because it plays on, the need to engage policymakers to invest in local knowledge, local languages, while at the same time they believe that everything should be integrated into that, and so you get policies which continue to say, because performance of children isn't where it should be, then English should be taught, should be used as a medium of instruction from grade 1, because then it will improve their proficiency. Well, the point is this, that proficiency in English does not mean that you've acquired knowledge in physics.
This is right. So because it's not just about knowledge acquisition,
No.
but it's about an analysis of that information and the lenses through which you interpret that knowledge. What I'm hearing all of you say is that lenses has to be indigenous, has to be local, and of course it can be applied. So having having a focus on the indigenization of an intellectualization of indigenous language doesn't necessarily preclude.
No.
And should not.
It does not.
Internationalization or being able to participate.
That unfortunately tends to be the misconstrue of some individuals. So every time others say we need to be able to get the children to make sense of what they're learning by facilitating, we should facilitate it through giving it to them in language they can understand. They believe, they misconstrue that to say, therefore, the other languages like English or French should be, boom, out.
Yes.
Well, no one is saying it's an either or.
Exactly.
All right.
I mean, the irony of us conducting this in English is
right.
lost on us.
Well, we realize that, English has become this international language. Right? So we can, it does facilitate communication across different, But the point is that when you go to, you go to the classroom, you are trying to acquire knowledge, and the question is, how is that acquisition of knowledge facilitated? Does it get facilitated by you having being given to you in a language you don't understand? I was in Poland recently, in end of July, at a conference on the International Political Science Association, and I presented on the politics of language choice in African education. And my opening paragraph, he knows it. Langa, I mean, he's usually aware of what I'm writing. I commented on the whole uproar we had about Afrikaans.
Of course.
Okay. And the uproar was, at Stellenbosch, was that, Afrikaans posed a problem for some students because they had to learn the content while trying to make sense of the language.
Yes.
Now, in a sense, that argument was disingenuous, because that's been the standard practice in African education anyway.
This is it.
So the question is, why should that constitute an oddity?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And the arguments had nothing to do with whether Afrikaans could not express scientific concepts. No. Yes. The whole argument was purely political.
Political, absolutely.
All right. And the thing is this, that that kind of, and you say, we wanted to decolonize. The content, we want to decolonize the language, and Stellenbosch has become, this language is mud in the, racism and, of apartheid and, promotion of white supremacy, etc. Those are political arguments.
That's right.
All right.
Right.
Now, take the child who leaves his village, goes to start grade 1 and has to deal with a language that, she doesn't understand.
Yes.
The child is in no position to articulate those arguments, but the child is in exactly the same position.
So the child is both cognitively incarcerated and linguistically crippled, incarcerated as well.
What a lovely way of expressing it. Cognitively incarcerated.
He uses it in his discourses.
Those are the terms. That's the terminology I've adapted. Because an African American psychologist, Wade Nobles, introduced the term of conceptual incarceration, and that was supposed to be where the content of what you learn is geared towards just trying to understand Western knowledge systems at the exclusion of other knowledge systems like those of Africans, African Americans, Native Americans, etc. All right, it says, so it's almost like you are incarcerated into that, and then I have a friend, a Kenyan scholar who teaches at Harvard, John Mugane. He introduced the term of linguistic incarceration to say that, you will get children who go to school and have to deal with the content in languages they cannot understand, where their own languages are now left out.
Yes.
So in effect, they don't just have problems with trying to understand it when learning reduces to simply memorizing, all right, but at the same time, they have major problems in expressing themselves.
Expressing,
so
you
have, and so I've used, those are the terms I've a doctrine of conceptual and linguistic incarceration, being something that seems to typify African education. And like I said, that the argument against Afrikaans, it does make sense, but one has to understand it's a political argument, all right, and that it's an argument we should also use when you start looking at our education.
It's the same thing. It is the same thing.
And to get talking about the use of scientific jargon, the jargon is devised to deal with the concepts as they arise, and sometimes ordinary language is modified, as Professor Bamgbose has pointed out. You can modify the semantics of ordinary language to capture specific meanings.
Yes.
I asked a student, in my class, I said, tell me, what's the difference between 15 and 20? And he said, well, 20 is bigger than 15. I said, sure. That is the way we use language.
Yes.
For the mathematician, the difference is 5.
Yes.
It's got a specific value.
Value.
But that's not the way we to use the term difference.
Yes.
They have given it and extended its meaning.
Yes.
So that it has a specific, construct.
And so there's a tenor and a tone,
right,
and a greater.
And the thing is this, that when was it in June? I interviewed a former student of mine. He's the university registrar of the University of Malawi, and I asked him to comment on that. He writes poetry in Chichewa, and to say, is it possible that what's your take on the view that these languages are no good for science? He said that's people say that are just lazy. And he gave an example of how the Reserve Bank of Malawi asked him to translate some document to do with economic stuff, etc. And he said, well, he took it on as a challenge, and he asked them to explain to him what the concept, what these things, words are supposed to stand for. And he said when they explained to him what this, that, and that, he discovered he didn't even have to devise new language. The words were already there in the language.
There. Right.
So in other words, the point is this, that
retrieval. It's about retrieval.
Absolutely. The point is this, that when we look at the resources, the linguistic resources we already have, and start adapting them or using them for the for the things we're trying to deal with, there's nothing that says one language is any more suited than another. And as Professor Bamgbose pointed out, it is one of the things that you have in linguistics, and philosophers have said that. I think Gerard Katz, in his book Semantic Theory, referred to it as principle of affability. Anything that is humanly conceivable is expressible in a human language.
In a human language, yes, yes. Professor Bamgbose, I want to come back to the notion of medium of instruction versus teaching African languages as a subject, right? Because it seems like you've identified a gap, if you like, in the literature on the subject, or even in practice. That while there is you have African languages as subjects in many African universities, what's missing is this development of medium of instruction, and yet we hear the practice at UKZN, which I understand it's unique in terms of this kind of development, or are there other sorts of examples across the continent like UKZN that is making a concerted effort to develop this?
In quite a number of places, there have been attempts to work out terminology for teaching other subjects. A lot of work has been done in Tanzania, for example, in Kiswahili for the sciences, medicine, mathematics. The real problem is that these efforts have remained at the level of getting materials ready. They have not moved on to the point where actual teaching has begun. And I'd like to listen to Dr. Khumalo about this. When say there's a policy, there's implementation. From what we know of language planning, the gap between policy and implementation is always this wide. Because we make the policy, this is what we want to do, but in terms of actually now carrying out what we say we want to do, there is a big gap. The UNESCO survey with a map in 2004 shows that there is no single African country that has an indigenous African language as a medium of instruction for teaching other subjects.
Right. So it remains.
Now, it is done in tutorials and a few things like that, informally. But that's not what we want.
Okay.
When we talk of intellectualization, we want to move beyond that so that we're able to use these languages to teach mathematics, sciences, and so on, medicine. The little experience I've had with teaching a language through the same language has been so wonderful in the sense that when we were teaching linguistics, Yoruba linguistics through English, what used to happen was that the students would listen very well, they would memorize, including jokes that I make in class. And when it comes to the examination, they will
so it's
regurgitate
rote learning, yes.
Rote learning.
Yes. So coming back to this issue about the gap between policy planning and then actual implementation, clearly there is a problem. There's a huge gap. Dr. Khumalo, and I think we need to round up our discussion with this. Would you attribute this to not just a lack of will, because clearly, at least at UKZN, there is a commitment, but perhaps to the practicalities of what it means to roll out this, and implement? I'm thinking, for example, of my days of being a Dean of Research and faced with the possibility of sending out a doctoral examination, not in the discipline of isiZulu, in another discipline. I think it was, I can't remember now what subject it was. I think it was anthropology, but it's written in isiZulu, right? How do you find examiners? Where do you get the international? Is that the issue, or is there something more going on?
There are a lot of issues, and that is cited as one of the issues that even when you do roll out these processes to fully academicize a language, have a thesis like you're citing in psychology in isiZulu to be examined, they reckon it's a nightmare. But that's an excuse more than anything. I mean, we do have sufficient academics, and now UKZN has produced a lot of PhDs in isiZulu, in disciplines other than isiZulu. And not only that, we have now scholarly articles that are published in isiZulu in accredited journals. So the effort to really intellectualize isiZulu at UKZN is actually a serious effort. And maybe to come back to connect that to the will. UKZN not only did it come up with a policy and an implementation plan, it institutionalized language planning and development. By way of a university charter. We have a charter that introduced the University Language Board, which reports to Senate.
Yes.
And below the University Language Board is a Language Planning and Development Office, which actually operationalizes the language plan, policy and plan, and reports quarterly to the ULB, to the University Language Board, which reports once a year to Senate and to the institutional forum. So UKZN has taken a much more serious approach and institutionalized the language issues.
Institutionalized its will almost, in a sense.
Indeed.
The political will is embodied there, right?
Exactly. This is what we want, and it's part of the transformation of this university so that it becomes a real premier institution of African scholarship. And once you have done that, then people can actually see how serious you are in terms of fully cultivating an otherwise African vernacular, so that it becomes a vernacular, a language that is at par with English, which speaks to the heart of our constitution, actually, because our constitution says all the 11 official languages must achieve this parity of esteem. And that's what we are trying to achieve at UKZN. And the will, the structures have been foundational to this progress. And maybe coming back to what we have done, we have not, because again, we're living in this whole global globalized village, technologically inspired world, we have leveraged on technology as well towards against accelerating the intellectualization process by not only developing this whole terminology development processes. We have developed an isiZulu national corpus,
Right.
upon which we are going to develop, and we are developing, human language technologies. Technologies that are necessary towards scientificating a language. And one of the technologies that we have developed is an isiZulu spell check. Not based on n-grams, for those who are technologically savvy, you know, but on anecdotal truncated speech, but based on the isiZulu national corpus, which means its recognition output is much higher and more based on the lexicon of the language, the full lexicon of the language. So the intellectualization effort is not only geared towards developing the terminology, it's also geared towards developing the necessary human language technologies that we need to use these languages in this technologically developed world. So it's a sustainable program. It can be done, but it needs resources, it needs commitment, and it needs the institute to recognize it. Not as tucked away in an African languages department where their preoccupation is teaching, then you give them this added responsibility, and it is going to be whoever is interested in developing the language can take up that. No, it's an institutional responsibility.
It's mainstream.
Mainstream.
It's mainstream.
And it cuts across all the sectors, both administrative and academic sectors of the university. That's how serious UKZN has taken into the intellectualization effort.
Okay, well, thank you. I think this discussion is so rich, and we can go on for the rest of the afternoon if we have to. Certainly, more of the discussion is going to be picked up in the workshops and in the plenaries and the keynotes, and I look forward to engaging further in those discussions. Thank you so much for your time. Clearly, I think there's lots more work to be done.
Yes.
But I also think we have some good examples to start from. So thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing, and I wish you well for your papers.
Thank you.